Well, good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all. I've got to be very careful this evening because this is being filmed, and so we have to be very serious and not make random side remarks, which people have been known to do on occasions such as this. But there'll be none of that this evening. We're here, of course, to listen to Sir Vince Cable. A few words about the context. Many of you I recognise, and so you know this, but those of you who are guests may not. We're in the Institute for Manufacturing, thanks to Professor Tim Minchell, the director, who would tell us if I encouraged him to, but I promised I wouldn't, what goes on here. IFM is part of the University Engineering Department, and it was put together to try and link engineering, economics and operations, and education, research and practice. These days we have over 250 people, over 100 PhD students, and the idea, the attempt, the aim is to try and make a better world through our better understanding of manufacturing. This evening is under the auspices of Cambridge Industrial Innovation and Policy, which is a group of 3 activities within the IFM. A research centre with my colleague Owen O'Sullivan, which is looking at research into industrial innovation policy and aspects of it. There's my colleague Carlos Lopez Gomez, who runs our Policy Links unit, which works with governments around the world, turning research into practice and helping with the development of industrial innovation policies. And then our own Babbage Forum, which is an international group of, again, economists, engineers and management folks trying to build better foundations for industrial innovation policy, which historically has been a rather fragmented activity. And over the next year, we're entering a new phase for Babbage, which will involve meetings in Europe, Asia, China and the USA, looking at the emerging challenges of industrial innovation policy. And those challenges, if you've been watching the news, are multiplying daily. I'm delighted to introduce Sir Vince Cable. A lot of people these days are talking about industrial policy. 10 years ago, you needed to be a very strange person and a very risk-taking person to talk about industrial policy because it was thought to be a foolish thing to do. Nobody now thinks it's foolish. In fact, they think it's absolutely essential. But of course, because there hasn't been much of it going on, there's lots of talk from people who've never actually done it. We're very privileged to have Sir Vince, who has actually done it and was the first person for many decades in government to build systematically an industrial strategy, industrial policy for the UK, which was very successful, and we're living still with the benefits of the things that he put in place. There has been a rather fallow period, without going into detail, where the importance of industrial strategy was less appreciated. That has now changed, and so it's very timely to ask Vince to talk to us about the return of industrial strategy.
Well, thank you very much for your warm introduction, and thanks for inviting me, and also thanks for what you do in this institute, which is a really remarkable place, as I've discovered from my visits here. I mean, not just in this rigorous thinking and multidisciplinary thinking about manufacturing, but the international network and collection of international knowledge that you've built up. You gave me a rather flattering introduction. I wouldn't claim all that much. I mean, except one of my achievements was to have survived for 5 years in my job, which in political terms is almost geological. I mean, after me, there have been, in the 10 years since, there have been 8 Secretary of State for Business, 6 Prime Ministers, and I know from government that what you can do in 18 months is close to zero. You need longevity. And the other thing I would claim is that although a lot of the things have moved on, and there isn't yet anything that one could call an industrial strategy now in the UK, there were some legacies of that period. The Catapult Network, the Aerospace Growth Partnership, the Automotive Propulsion Centre, a lot of the trading schemes which grew out of apprenticeships, the British Business Bank, the Green Investment Bank, which still survives, it's in Edinburgh, private sector now. So there are bits and pieces which can now be built on by my successors if they choose to apply themselves. And the other final thing I would say personally is that having spent 5 years telling business people how to do business, I'm now trying to do it myself in my retirement, and finding doing it is actually a lot harder than talking about it. And the companies I run in the energy transition sector, batteries and hydrogen, are proving very difficult. You begin to realize how difficult the energy transition is when you're actually doing it as a business person. But let me just plunge into the subject. I want to ask the question, what is industrial strategy? What is industrial policy? It's not altogether obvious what it is. Why do we do it? Again, for a lot of practitioners, it may be blindingly obvious, but certainly in the UK it isn't. Which countries do what? And given that we're now in the UK beginning to think about industrial policy again, how do you do it? What are the building blocks this government, my successors, now need to do to get it in place? I'll start with these three quotes. Foster and Fletcher, this is a sort of big 700-page book that's appeared this year that sort of puts everything together, theory, practice, cross-national experience. Sound national industrial policy must be highly specific to industries. And the UK Green Paper, which is actually rather similar, sort of focusing on growth sectors. And in the middle is the statement that accompanied the industrial strategy that I launched. More of a whole of government, cross-government approaches. And I think you can see lurking in those three quotes a difference of approach. Is it about industry and specific industries, or is it about generally raising productivity levels, particularly in the traded sector, which is predominantly manufacturing? Is it discriminatory or non-discriminatory? And I've produced this funny little chart designed to illustrate in theoretical terms essentially what I think industrial policy is about. The orthodox view is that you don't need to have an industrial strategy. Basically, you just need to do a lot of good general things and do them properly to encourage innovation, have a generous approach to R&D, getting over financial obstacles to growth companies, good training apprenticeship systems, managing the exchange rate, an absolutely critical factor we've rather lost sight of in recent years. Rules around data, of course, now become central. IP, certainly one of the big reforms I brought in government around copyright, absolutely fundamental to industries, activities that depend on intellectual properties. Standard setting, a much neglected area of policy, and competition, regulation, making access to the energy grid, fundamental general issues which you need to sort out, which don't need to be related to any particular activity. But then you have what I call the vertical dimension, things that concentrate on particular companies or particular sectors, tariffs, subsidies, government procurement, export controls, targets, and the state as an entrepreneur. There are in many countries, not in the UK, this idea is that the government's job is to pioneer and lead. But then there's a third dimension, as I discovered, because I'd rather neglected it in the industrial strategy I was doing until the end, until people started pointing out that the north of England felt rather excluded from some of the things we were doing. And so there's the dimension of place, the north-south divide and all that, but related to that, clusters, export processing zones, which Sunak was very keen on, infrastructure, development, regional policy. But that's very theoretical. But in also to try and answer the what question, I've gone back a little bit into history. Where did industrial policy come from? Who did it? When? Where? My impression is that probably the first discernible example of industrial policy in the UK was Henry VII, but I'm sure the Chinese would claim that they did something in the Tang dynasty, which was long before. But somebody obviously told Henry VII that there was something slightly odd about producing lots of wool in the Cotswolds and the Pennines, and then importing very expensive woolen clothes from France or the Flemish bits of Spain. And so they banned the export of raw wool in order to add value. I'm sure they didn't talk about added value in the Tudor court, but that was the concept that originated. And similarly, 200 years later, the Navigation Acts, which were designed systematically to promote high-value exports and import raw materials. Again, it wasn't framed in the language we use today, but a rather protectionist approach to development, but what you could call industrial policy. I think thirdly, and probably the most important intellectually, was I'm sure you've all heard of Alexander Hamilton. I did a book a few years ago which was called Money and Power, which is about politicians who made a fundamental difference to the way we think about economics. And he's really the hero of the book, probably more important than any of the other founding fathers of America, certainly more than Jefferson and Madison. And he did some remarkable things. I mean, he did a lot of thinking about manufacturing and why it matters. And it was evidence-based research. It's things we'd recognize today. He sent hundreds of letters around the world to try to understand why manufacturing, as it was understood at the end of the 18th century, why it mattered and what advantages there were to the United States by trying to colonize that area of production. He also brought in the concept of infant industry protection, which is a level of sophistication about tariffs way beyond what's now happening in Trump's America. Hamilton was a passionate believer in Adam Smith. He carried the wealth of nations around in his knapsack during the war against the British. And he understood about why protectionism was a bad idea, mercantilism, as it was then called, was a bad idea. But he realized that there had to be some exceptions, and he developed a very rigorous theoretical framework that was later developed by John Stuart Mill and others for exceptions which allowed an industrial policy to happen. A very carefully qualified, calibrated approach to policy, which we certainly don't see in the United States now. List was a slightly cruder approach, building up a case for national industrialization. And a crucial point in the development was actually the defeat of the South in the American Civil War, because, of course, the South's economy was based on exporting raw materials produced by slaves and importing manufactures, which was totally contrary to the interests of New England and the northern states. And when the North won, they flipped the policy, imposed stiff tariffs in order to protect American manufacturing. And this pretty much continued throughout later American history, and it explains why tariffs are so much part of the psyche in America. And Trump's heroes like McKinley were people who really pushed that agenda later. But of course, not just in the United States, the Japanese, the Meiji Restoration, and later the idea that you have to plan your industrialization and build up basic industries on a systematic basis. And Bismarck, also an interesting character here. Bismarck was a passionate believer in free markets. He was another devotee of Adam Smith. He qualified it slightly. You may remember the Zollverein, which was a free single market, uniting Germany, but with a tariff to keep out the nasty Austrians. But he was persuaded after an economic crisis in the 1870s by a group of industrialists led by a man called Kardorff, that what Germany needed to do was to absolutely get full-blooded behind the steel industry, the chemical industry, heavy engineering, as an instrument of war, which of course was what appealed to Bismarck. So he became an architect of industrial policy. Of course, the British had done really figure on this list after Henry VII. There was a brief period when it became fashionable. There was a man called Joseph Chamberlain, some of you may remember. His son was the architect of Munich. Joseph Chamberlain was an imperialist and extreme economic nationalist, but much of his rhetoric would have found a happy home in America today. And there's a passage which I dug out from, I think, the first book I ever wrote, which was called Protectionism, Industrial Decline, which set out the British attitude to all of this. And he, forgive me just reading a passage, but I think it's quite elegant. It says, "It's your fault if you don't leave the industry which is falling and join the industry which is rising. Well, sir, it's an admirable theory. It satisfies everything but an empty stomach. Look how easy it is. Your once great trade in sugar refining is gone. All right, try jam. Your iron trade is going. Never mind, you can make mouse traps. The cotton trade is threatened. Well, what does that matter? You can try doll's eyes. And how long is this going to go on?" And essentially it was this rather plaintive, angry, negative feeling that the British had, or some, like him, that leading from the front, which is of course what Britain did in the Industrial Revolution, was becoming a bit of a mug's game, and you were never going to catch up, and we're gradually losing all these industries to the Germans and the Japanese. And what the government needed to do was to stop all this free trade nonsense and stick up tariffs in the way the Germans and the Americans were doing. Because Chamberlain never cut through. It was generally thought to be nonsense and damaging. And that battle that the Liberals essentially won over the imperialist conservatives at that time really dominated the last century. It was the intellectual environment that we're all steeped in, and I encountered in government. So against this background, you then get onto the why issue. You know, why have an industrial strategy at all? And of course, what I had to do was to try to make out a case to the Treasury, which is deeply sceptical about all this stuff. And I've summarized some of the arguments that, you know, anybody operating or trying to do an industrial policy, they would have to advance. Of course, there are economic externalities from R&D. You know, you get spillover of knowledge from one company to another. There are some things which don't operate within the time horizons of markets. Nuclear power, classically, aerospace, the long-termism issue. Fundamental innovations, and you know, we've got a whole cluster of big new ideas which have come out of laboratories. Systemic effects, clusters, supply chains, the natural monopolies that have been generated by internet platforms were once generated by new telecom systems and transport systems. Failures of knowledge, supply chain mapping. And what is now becoming a very powerful theme, security. I mean, when I was interested in this stuff, it wasn't really a big issue, but the big bogey of China is now waved in front of every discussion on this subject. So that, if you're trying to make a case for an industrial policy today, these are some of the things you would be arguing. I have to say, when I brought in industrial strategy, it wasn't anything like so systematic. I think it's worth recording. I embarked on this as really of three conversations. One was Ratan Tata came to my office, the owner of Tata's, owners of the steel, British Steel and Jaguar Land Rover, and he said, well, he's a passionate believer in Britain. He was an engineer, loved engineering, and he loved the British traditions in this area. But he said, look, your car industry has been shot to pieces. About 40% of the inputs into the car industry are British. The rest you're importing, and you've lost your supply chains because of the financial crisis. You know, unless you do something about it, the car industry is dying. You know, you must help us. If I'm going to invest here, I need your support. Blah blah blah. I had a similar meeting a few weeks later with the heads of all the aerospace companies, Rolls-Royce, BAE Systems, forgotten the others now, Bombardier, Westland, now Leonardo. And they all said, look, we've come to see you because at the moment it looks fine. You've got an aerospace industry, pride of the world, your leading export industry, but it's dying. There isn't enough R&D being done in the UK. Frankly, it would make more sense to us to shift our operations to France, or probably Germany. So you've got to do something. And gradually all this was sinking into my head. And then we had a crisis, some of you may vaguely remember, when the Department of Transport, going through the standard procurement procedures, awarded the big contractor Siemens, which meant that Bombardier in Derby and various other places would simply close down. And there was a great rumpus, and I got a torrent of abuse from people living in Derby. And Philip Hammond, who was the Transport Secretary, and I met on a street corner, actually. It was not the way British government worked, and agreed that this was not a sensible way to organise British industry, and we needed to fundamentally change public procurement. And so all these three things came together, and it just happened that Michael Heseltine had an office in my corridor. It was unofficial, but I think he saw the department as a good place to park his Jaguar. But anyway, he came to my office and we discussed how to persuade Conservative ministers that industrial strategy might be a good idea. So he helped me draft a letter to the Prime Minister, and the rest was history. But of course it didn't, all these points were not sort of automatically accepted, because there are plenty of people who say, well, why not have one? There are lots of negatives. There are opportunity costs. You put money into one industry, something else can't function. The basic opportunity cost concept in economics. And that applies in, I was reading about India's problems the other day. They're pouring billions into a big chip foundry to try and compete with Taiwan and the United States. And a lot of sensible people are saying this is a terrible idea. You should be spreading the funding in a different way. Opportunity costs is at the heart of industrial policy choices. You may protect your steel industry, which is what the British government's doing at the moment, but if you do it in a certain way, the way Trump's dealing with it, then of course you pass on the cost to steel-using industries, which is probably a much more potent source of employment. Some decisions are highly politicized. You can see this going on in the United States at the moment. You can have one industrial strategy based on the Green Deal, and you have one based on the oil industry, and they're not consistent. We're overtaken by events. Money being poured into the data processing centers in the United States in particular, and here also. The question now being raised, is that demand justified in a deep-seek world? Similarly, jobs illusion. A lot of industrial strategy is justified politically by creating jobs, but it often doesn't. A classic piece of work on industrial strategy was written in Cambridge here when I first started taking interest in it. A man called John Odling Smee in the economics department, who wrote about the Dundee jute industry, which I think was the first attempt at industrial policy in Britain since the Second World War. Somebody said something must be done about all this jute imports from India. It's killing Dundee. And so we imposed all kind of quotas. And of course, inevitably what happened is the price went up, gave a big incentive to placky bags, and placky bags have replaced jute, and lots of jobs were lost, a handful of jobs in a chemical factory. So that's a story of lots of industrial intervention. Retaliation from attempts to build up the electric vehicles industry. And, we still operate, despite Trump, within rules, and some countries in the single market we no longer are, and the World Trade Organization. So there's a very powerful voice in government saying, think again, do we really need all this stuff? There are so many problems, blah, blah, blah. So why and why not? And this is a very impressionistic, subjective view that, there are some successes, there are some failures. I'm not sure where you come down on all this, but I think in the UK there are a lot of bits and pieces of industrial policy and industrial strategy which unequivocally would regard as success stories. And the fact that Rolls-Royce has survived, one of the two big engine makers in the world, the vaccine project, some of the things in the industrial strategy like the AGP and the APC, the catapults, even creative industries, the fact that the BBC and the Channel 4 pioneered a lot of program making. These are successes of state-led intervention. But we have all those failures, the Concorde, British Steel, the bit of Leyland that finished up in Longbridge, and which is now involved in making MGs in Shanghai, the machine tool interventions, and AGR, nuclear power reactors, our attempt to create a computer company, all the failures, which of course are now cited as why industrial policy is a bad thing. And I rather cheekily put banking there because, of course, for a long time it was assumed that the city would sustain the British economy, and we now know better. And things that we can't yet make a judgment on, the area, for example. I put ARM there because this is interesting. It was the one real major British high technology leader, and it has been sold off to a Japanese owner. But lots of its activities still remain around Cambridge. Do we regard this as a success or failure? I'm not sure what the verdict is. And there are sort of parallel stories in the United States, a long list of failures, but also big successes, particularly coming out of DARPA. Japan also, we tend to think as, how to do industrial policy, look at the Japanese. And they had their big successes. But some terrible failures. I mean, the Japanese attempt to get into software on a big scale and make civil aviation, civil airliners, sort of wasted a lot of money and achieved nothing. They were going to be a big chip exporter, but they didn't. It's Taiwan and Korea which have mastered that. And bits of their economy which terribly low productivity despite attempts to do otherwise. So successes and failures. Now, this is my question, where is industrial policy? This is very schematic. There's no science in this diagram at all. But I've basically tried to put countries on a map, roughly between what you might call orthodox, open market, emphasis on horizontal industrial policy, non-discriminatory, and the more, what I call the vertical, the discriminatory. And the reds are the superpowers, the blues are the mid-powers, and the smaller countries at the bottom. And again, this is very impressionistic, but of course the key people at the moment are the Chinese. Under Deng and his successor, the emphasis was on general policy, in particular exchange rate. Xi has now become highly interventionist in a prescriptive way. The new productive forces, very directed, very, very vertical in my terminology. The US has been pulled from a fairly open, non-discriminatory emphasis on supporting research and so on, to the Biden approach, which was very interventionist and very prescriptive. We don't know what Trump will do. I've cheekily put the UK with a wigwag because it's not terribly clear where we're going, backward or forward. It's worth thinking about Israel and Singapore, two really interesting examples of small open economies, but with quite successful and significant industrial policies. And I've tried to classify countries because talking about industrial policy in aggregate doesn't seem to be terribly helpful because different countries have different problems, different structures. I think the superstates are in a different league. US, China, competing across the board with new technologies and a wide range of industries. And I put the EU, should it happen. Of course, the EU doesn't function as a unit, but potentially could. And then what I've called the mid-powers, but they're very, very different. India, very highly protected industrialization, very, very different from the East Asia export-led approach, or what I call the open regionalism of the European countries, or indeed the ASEAN countries. And then small states, any Australians may balk at being called a small state, but again, rather different. Large numbers of small countries, very dependent on resources, developed open economies, the Nordics. It was very striking that I think at Mike's last conference was the presentation we had from the Swedes and the Swiss, amongst others, who said, what's all this industrial policy? We don't need it. We can't do it anyway. We're open economies, so we just got to go with the winds. But some do. Singapore, Israel, highly entrepreneurial states with a very, very focused approach. So the where question is quite complex, and it depends very much on size and system. Just two things to point out about that. China, which is the blue line, share of industrial production in the world, now produces more industrial product than the 10 next countries combined, including the United States and Japan and Germany. It basically is the world manufacturing country, and it's well over a third. You get slightly different results from value added, but as opposed to gross production. But the story is the claim that China now totally dominates global industrial production, totally. And the crisis we're all building up to is the intensification of that, because China has this structural imbalance, shortage of domestic demand relative to production, and the production, which is industrial, is spilling out into the world economy, and somebody's got to absorb it. And the Americans are making it very clear they're not going to do it. Immovable objects and irresistible force. I mean, if that is the big clash we're now heading towards. And of course, at a global level, this is essentially the battleground, which is R&D spending. China and the US, you can measure things in different ways. I've just used 2015 valuation of the dollar, but it gives a rough idea. You've got two superpowers spending massively on R&D. You've got middle countries led by Japan. Korea is in that group largely because it commits so much of a percentage of GDP towards it. And some small countries also, Israel and Switzerland as another, spending massively on R&D, private and public. The UK is not terribly well placed in that league table. And this is another sort of wildly impressionistic picture. There's no measurement here. This is just where the technology race is at, something that will in a way define our future. You've got low nanometer chips with, I think there's a 2 nm production out of Taiwan in the last few weeks. And they're clearly ahead with the United States. But we don't know, and the Chinese are working flat out to catch up, as they have doing with AI language models. Of course, DeepSeek has totally changed the calculation. But there are some areas where the Chinese are clearly well ahead technologically and in terms of production, and most obviously green energy and their supply chains, way ahead. I would argue nuclear power too. There are, I think, 35 reactors being built in China at the moment. There's one in the United States. And they're developing the technology for different scales and so on. Telecoms, again, with Huawei now into 6G, dominant. I think Britain actually made a terrible mistake by walking away from Huawei in 2017. I and later Theresa May, who had focused on this problem, tried to keep Huawei here, at least working in partnership with BT and Vodafone. They're quite keen to keep the relationship. But the Americans said, no, you cannot. It was a very clear message. You are a vassal state. You'll do what you're told. So we had to drop them. So I'm being a bit provocative here, but certainly in the telecoms field, if you wanted the best technology, you went Chinese. That's still the case. And I've tried to do the same in a very schematic way for some of the others. Probably the most important one is at the bottom, where we're dealing with a whole range of things. And I think the Americans like to think that they're ahead in defense technology. There are other important niche areas, drone technology, where hypersonic flight, where the Chinese may well be overtaking them. So this is just impressionism, but it's trying to capture a sense that what is really driving a lot of technological involvement by governments in industrial strategy is this race, the big race, and clearly China's winning in some areas, the United States in another. Right, so let me just conclude by saying a little bit about Britain. What do we do? I've deliberately coloured this in differently because green is the periods in modern history when governments have been open to the idea of industrial strategy, and red is when they've been against it. And you see what's happened, that every few years, change of government, change of prime minister, we go against it and then we're in favour of it. Certainly the chaotic period since 2015-17, I was called in for a cup of coffee by my successor, who said, look, there's nothing personal, but your name and your party's name is on industrial strategy, so we've got to get rid of it. And for 2 years, that was the thinking that prevailed. But then Greg Clark, with the encouragement of Theresa May and her advisors, revived it, thought it was actually a good idea. But that lasted 2 years, and then when Theresa May dropped, the policy dropped, new government attempt to revive it. So we've been in, out, and that's the pattern pretty much since the Second World War. Even in the 70s, Heath had a period of, getting rid of industrial policy, terrible idea. Then 2 years later, changed tack. Problems in the shipyards industry, Rolls-Royce and so on. Then that led into, Harold Wilson's second term in office, then the Thatcher reaction. I put the Blair period in blue, because I'm not really quite sure how to classify it. You remember Ed Balls' immortal phrase about post-neoclassical endogenous growth, which essentially meant horizontal industrial policy. Let's have lots of R&D and science spending, but we don't want to get into this vertical stuff about picking winners. So it's in and out. But my central point here is that Britain's problem is that ever since the war, we've never had a consistent approach. It's been in, out, highly ideological, highly dependent on individuals, and from an industrial point of view, utterly infuriating because you never know what the next government is going to do. And this is my attempt to sort of list roughly where we are at the moment based on what was doing when I was in the coalition government, the kind of sectors that we tried to pay attention to and support. Basically, it was mirrored in the Theresa May era. Oil and gas dropped out because we were becoming greener, and a few things were added. And the current Labour government has begun to specify a little bit what they want to concentrate on, but it's essentially the same agenda. So it's a mixture of advanced manufacturing, trying to build up supply chains, though for various reasons the railways and the oil and gas industry have sort of fallen out of favour. The energy transition, at least for the moment. Foundation industries, it's an interesting concept, of course. Is steel a foundation industry, or could we do without it? I mean, do we really need a steel industry? When I was there, we didn't have it because the European Union industrial policy, the competition policy effectively forbade it. There was so much overcapacity. The last thing they wanted to do was to encourage governments to invest in the steel industry. But it's now come back, and this government. How to treat digital, which of course is a rapidly evolving sector and means rather different things. And a key point is that I took the view that although manufacturing is massively important, disproportionately important for tradables, for R&D, overall productivity, you can't just be dogmatic and exclude services, some of which are important. We had creative industries, for example. Not just the UK, I discovered in Singapore, for example, has a very proactive treatment of creative industry. Korea too, actually, as part of their industrial strategy. Universities are really an industry, or they were until governments decided that foreign students were nasty immigrants and had to be kept out. But certainly we treated them as an export industry that merited support. So that's, again, a bit schematic, but it's an attempt to show how, certainly when I was in government, we worked towards identifying sectors that merited support of one kind or another, and that's broadly been continued. And if the Labour government do proceed with their proposed industrial policy, it will look a little bit like that. Now then, let me just finish up with this. What is to be done if it's to be successful? I'd start with the politics, because if you have punch and judy politics, which we tend to get in this country, you're not going to get anywhere, right? You have to have opposition buy-in. It has to be non-partisan, and certainly after had their fingers burnt so often, British businesses are not going to waste time on a project which they think is going to be turfed out at the next general election. So you've got to get buy-in. It goes completely against our tribal traditions, but it has to happen. You've got business. It's no point just having a civil service-driven policy. Business has got to buy in. And it's got to be long-term, really long-term, not just long-term in British terms, which 5 years is an eternity in the UK, but it has to be embedded in legislation, a bit like the climate change targets. Not that that's completely proof, as we know from what's happened to the aid commitment. Governments can drop it, but if it's embedded in legislation, there's a reasonable chance it's going to survive. I would say it has to be sector-based, but should be flexible and include service industries. One of the big areas which I tried to tackle through the British Business Bank in particular was business finance, but we are horribly underserved by the finance sector. With enormous problems still with proof of concept funding, which you will know all about in Cambridge. Scale up, I know, because I'm chairman of a company that's trying to scale up, and literally having to go down on bended knees and beg people for money because there isn't a system in the UK for properly funding scale-ups in high-tech industries. Innovation support, I think we've made good progress there. I think the Catapult network is generally thought to be a big success. I don't know about ARIA, who came in more recently. We've got all the money, but certainly we have the infrastructure. Training is a disaster area. I tried to get apprenticeship policy aligned, but then they brought in the apprenticeship levy, which killed off quite a lot of it. And you've got to link in also with immigration policy, which is, again, a nightmare. But, you know, we're desperately short of skilled people, particularly in the engineering sector. Don't forget the third dimension. It's got to fit in with geography. One of the good things that's happened, I think, in recent years is the recognition of the importance of metro mayors and Manchester and the rest showing some initiative at a local level. But the problem is, if every village wants its own fab, you know, what do you do? You know, who says no? You've got to have some strategy, and that, if it's to be meaningful, somebody has to make choices. So it's, I say, difficult. And then finally, maybe events this week have crystallized it a little bit more, but there's a lot of talk about industrial strategy on a European level, and Draghi and now cooperation on defence. You know, who knows? Certainly we're going to have to, in the next year, agree with the European Union how to deal with the carbon trading scheme, and various other policies which are currently inconsistent. But certainly if the energy transition aspects of industrial strategy are going to work, it needs to be done on a European level. We're quite a long way from that. So this is my list. There may be people from Whitehall here who know what's going on, but I think unless there's a tick in most of those boxes, we're not going anywhere. But I think, you know, my subjective impression is that the penny has dropped and that some of this may well happen. Thank you.
Well, Vince, thank you for a wonderfully authoritative and insightful overview, and you actually end up by suggesting what should happen rather than saying on the one hand and on the other hand, so that's wonderful. Usual rules apply. If you'd like to ask a question, put your hand up, and if I like to look at you, I'll give you the option to come in. They're all too scared. Professor Mitchell.
Thank you. A fantastic talk. What a great overview. That point you raised there about Britain flip-flopping all the way through, every few years it changes. And yet, as you say, there have been successes, like the Catapult network. Is there something about, we have to just assume there will be a constant process of change, and so therefore focus on things that are very hard to undo?
Yeah.
Is that a message?
Yes, it is. I mean, the Catapult network's a good example. I mean, I think it could well have disappeared in 2015, but we actually had a guardian angel in the Treasury. There was a Sir John, his name was just gone, it wasn't Knighton, but there was a second permanent secretary who loved it and saw that this had generated enormous value for the UK economy. So when the Vandals were out with the knives, he sort of protected it. So it's actually the civil service establishment that needs to be totally committed, and above all the Treasury. You can't do anything without the Treasury. I mean, that is, you know, lesson number one in politics. You have to work with the grain of the Treasury, and if they own it, they will try to make sure it continues from one government to another. But I think that after all our disappointments, we probably becoming a little bit less politically tribal. I'd like to think so. And this idea, which we had in 2010, and certainly Blair had in 1997, that we need to scrub history and reinvent the wheel, that kind of mentality, I hope we've grown out of, because unless we do, we not make any headway.
I had a question about, so the industrial policy has been state-led for entire history, right? Because the state is who's creating it. But some of the companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta are becoming so big. In fact, their market cap is bigger than GDPs of some nations. Do you think they are going to exert more influence on industrial policy moving forward because that's where the money is? Or do you think differently about it?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't have an easy answer to it. I mean, the glib response is, well, you've got to try and co-opt them. And they do derive a certain amount of kudos from being seen to be partners and collaborators. But one of the big battles which is looming up is how the Trump administration and all the tech companies are going to deal with the European Commission, which, as you know, has been very proactive in dealing with monopoly and acquisitions which are anti-competitive. Trump is saying the European Union must stop doing it. These are our, tech bros. You do as you're told. Don't interfere with them. So it's I think more at a European level than a British level that this battle is going to happen. That if there's going to be some coordinated European approach to industry policy, it will involve the Europeans either co-opting or developing competitive alternatives to some of the big platform companies. And that's going to involve a battle. But if you're at UK level, then we don't really have any alternative but to try to co-opt Microsoft and the rest of them into the system and work with them. And in some ways they can be quite helpful. Certainly when I was in government, Microsoft were quite constructive partners in the work around information technology. They actually had a very good training schemes, which we worked with them on. So it's not all negative, but I mean, you pose a fundamental question. You know, it's very difficult for medium-sized governments like ours, or even bigger one. You know, India is a good example. I mean, how does a country like India tackle Google, Apple, the rest of them? They're trying to co-opt Apple into outsourcing, but Apple are kicking up and saying, you know, we will do what we want to do, not what you're telling us to do. But yeah, you've stated the problem. I don't have a simple answer to it.
Given what you've said about the civil service and the Treasury in particular, do sufficient of them have the right background experience to see this as something they're going to get rid of?
Well, some do. I mean, I don't think many senior officials in Whitehall have had industrial experience. Some of them have had business experience, not the same thing. No, I think we're seriously deficient in that area. Where big business associated with manufacturing industry has got close links with government. A classic case is the Ministry of Defence and BAE Systems, but that's capture rather than cooperation. It's not quite the same thing. And certainly in what I've been talking about, there's quite a narrow boundary between capture and cooperation. You bring companies onto a sector working party, which was some of the things we did, but of course they're there to promote their own commercial interest. In the car industry, we had enlightened self-interest. Companies like Ford took leadership in organising the rest of the sector to commit themselves to big R&D projects alongside government. We sort of got that kind of cooperation in aerospace, but you knew that the bottom line is that executives have to explain to their shareholders why they're committing money to a joint project with government, and the ones that are ruthless will effectively take over government. But that's one of the arguments why free market theorists say don't go anywhere near this, because you'll get industries will capture government. But I think there are ways around it, but it's a genuine dilemma.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for your talk. My name is Carlos. I work here at the Institute. My question is about sectors. So now you mentioned the 8 growth sectors that have been identified, one of which is advanced manufacturing. And I think if we look back at the history of industrial policy in the UK, one of the innovations during your time at the department was the narrative around sectors being different. But being here at the Institute for Manufacturing, we see advanced manufacturing as a big label for many sectors that are very different, like aerospace, like automotive. And you have here about your question about flexibility. No, in that. Well, yes, precisely. So how did you approach these differences between manufacturing sectors, and how do you see that playing out in this new administration?
Well, I got the department's economists to do some number crunching, reveal comparative advantage, productivity levels, productivity growth, in order to provide some objective basis for the industrial groups that we were trying to support. So it wasn't all plucked out of thin air. But at the end of the day, some of it was plucked out of thin air. I mean, there was no obvious reason why you would want to focus an industrial policy on the construction industry, which doesn't satisfy any of your criteria for international competitiveness or productivity levels, but which intuitively you realize is absolutely crucial to the function of the economy. You can't develop your infrastructure, and yes, you've got people digging tunnels and and the construction industry in Britain is in a terrible state. So we made that one of the core bits of the industrial strategy. The choice of which energy sectors you use was, again, politically driven. I mean, when I was there, the green revolution hadn't really taken hold, so we didn't feel particularly uncomfortable with supporting the supply chains of Aberdeen and oil and gas. Well, of course, that's no longer politically acceptable. But so we did try to use there are systematic measures for evaluating, which are your potential growth sectors based on British and international experience, and which you should probably be working with. But a certain amount of non-dogmatic improvisation is also necessary if the thing is going to work.
Thank you. Going back to the UK's, shall we say, patchy record in investment in R&D, which I think has been an issue for at least 30 years, is that because at Treasury level there's an equivalent of the private sector shareholder value mentality of, if I can extract £1 today, it's better than waiting 10 years and extracting £10 then? Because it's something that seems to have been a perpetual conundrum as long as I've been working.
Yes, no, it is. It's not that the Treasury people are stupid. They're not. I mean, and they do numbers, and they will see that there is national advantage from investing in R&D beyond purely the cost. But they will say to a government, but the way that government finance operates is within departmental spending ceilings, right? And if, in my department, the choice may well have been to invest more in R&D or subsidising students' accommodation. And if you don't want students to riot, you spend your money there rather than on the R&D. I mean, to put it crudely, that was the kind of choices we were having to make. So yeah, the Treasury are not stupid, and I think that was one of the reasons why the catapult network survived, because anybody could see who did run a few numbers that the added value we were getting from it was so disproportionate to the cost that it would have been idiotic to scrap it, which some of the people wanted to do. I mean, it saved money. And of course, what drives policy ultimately, certainly in the UK, is the bond market. And you can make a powerful intellectual case for government borrowing, for investment. But if the bond market believes you're borrowing too much, they can kill you. The Liz Truss experience, and certainly when I was in government, all our decisions around public spending had to be set against this ultimate metric: how much can the government borrow into the markets? I mean, I think one of the good things about Rachel Reeves, nobody's yet noticed it really, or given credit, is that I think it's the first Chancellor for many years who has accepted the principle of borrowing to invest, which includes R&D. But whether the markets can distinguish between borrowing to invest and borrowing to just do routine government things has yet to be seen. We may well have a bond market revolt.
Thank you. My name's Darren Joint. I run a small manufacturing business. I've got two, hopefully brief questions. One is about SMEs. You not really mentioned in the conversation. Yeah. Where do you think that fits into industrial policy? Yeah. And the second is, when do you think, if ever, we might have another coalition government?
Well, I think the second is, I think not the second, probably not for quite a long time. Certainly my people went into it for a mixture of reasons, but part of it was a belief that some of the national interests, you need to work with other parties during an economic crisis. We suffered almost terminal political damage from doing so, and I think the collective memory will be never again. You work with a government in various supportive ways, but never get dragged into another coalition unless you've changed the voting system first. Right? That will be the message. SMEs, yeah, you're absolutely right, that these things tend to be dominated by the big boys. We always tried to get an SME voice in certainly in the construction industry that was easier to organise, or the ICT sector, than it was in, say, aerospace, where you've got long supply chains. I think one of the things we did do, but in other ways, was to, for example, in terms of business finance, one of the things I did set up was something called the Business Growth Fund, and that was a recognition that one of the big problem areas are these rapid growth, medium-sized companies that get to a certain stage and then can't raise capital in the market. And so actually a very successful institution, established private sector, but with government prompting and initially a bit of government money, is now filling that role. But within an industrial strategy, it's quite difficult to fit in the voice of tens of thousands of small businesses. You can get the FSB to send a representative or something, but it's a bit tokenistic. I think it's just whoever is operating this policy doesn't need to understand that it's the medium-sized growth companies which are at the heart of productivity growth in the UK. And getting too carried away with structures and consultative mechanisms involving the big boys is in danger of losing that. But you can't build it in a formal way.
Well, I've got an eye on the clock, and we should probably let you... one last... I'm being pointed at by several people. Susie, last one to you. Back there.
I'll hand over to you afterwards. But I just want to ask, I work here, so like in the university. I was just wondering, like, kind of, if you now think about your talk and so on, what are the things, if we now have 20 quid in the hand, what should we take the 20 quid for and invest it into the university to do to support, I mean, king and country, or, you know, the industrial policy, or the government, or however you may want to say it?
So I wasn't sure whether to take the question literally or... no, if you have 20 quid to invest, you should be putting it into a high-risk growth company, at which simultaneously, you know, they pay off, but certainly that's where the country needs the capital to be growing.
Yeah, so you probably wouldn't invest it in a low-growth university like...
No, I think you'd ask Professor Gregory here to identify some proof of concept companies in Cambridge that need some money.
I think perhaps we ought to continue this conversation over a drink. Susie, last word to you.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering what your views are on the championing of the Oxford-Cambridge arc is by Patrick Vallance, Lord Vallance, which is being situated under the industrial strategy, but hasn't worked for many, many years and many attempts previously. Why would it work now?
Yes, well, the government seems to be leaning towards it at the moment. I have to say, one of my big problems when I was Secretary of State, when we were rolling out the Catapult programme, was to try to stop every single project being inside the London, Oxford and Cambridge triangle. Right? And all the weight of opinion from universities, business was, yeah, we're comfortable in this area of the country. And it was my job to say, actually, no. And I insisted that some of the catapults were based up north, you know, uncomfortable places like Newcastle and so on. And so it involved actually, there is enough gravity pulling together the Oxford-Cambridge-London triangle without much government prompting. I know it'd be nice to have a railway line, but it's not fundamental, I don't think. Whereas a railway line across the Pennines would make a hell of a difference. So that would be where my priority would be.
Despite living here, I absolutely agree with you. Okay, it's been an absolutely fascinating session. I would say inspiring. There are a lot of people in the room who are great admirers of the work you did when you were Secretary of State, and it's a relief to some extent that a lot of the things you set in place are already there. They haven't been wiped away. It is to be hoped that the people who are now in charge will be listening to your wisdom and take some of the principles as we go forward. But thank you for sharing it with us.
Okay.